One of the fabulous things about user stories is that somebody has come up with a nice acronym for the criteria with which you can assess the merits of a user story. That acronym is the INVEST acronym. That is, any user story should be independent, negotiable, valuable, estimable, small, and testable. Got all that? Okay, we'll go through those one by one. Independent. Stories are easy to work with if they are independent. That is, we'd like them not to overlap in concept, and we'd like to be able to schedule and implement them in any order. Now, this is not always possible because you do get dependencies, particularly with infrastructure. I have to have this function before I can have that function. There are dependencies between things, but as far as possible, we would like the user story to be independent of all other user stories. Right? Negotiable. A good story is negotiable. It's not an explicit contract for features. Rather, details will be co-created with the customer. There is this myth that somehow the customer's problem is they're fully formed and fully specifiable. In fact, what the problem is and what the solution is co-evolve. The problem that the customer wants solved depends on what can be solved. And what can be solved depends on what the problem is. So, the two of them go around. You start talking to somebody and you get into this negotiation about what the problem actually is. So, user stories are negotiable. You negotiate with the user what the user story is actually going to cover and what it's actually going to do. A good story does capture the essence and not the details. The details are implementation details, and it's assumed that you're going to be talking to the customer and capturing those at the time you're implementing them. Over time, the card may acquire notes, test ideas, and so on, but we don't need these to prioritize or schedule stories. The user story that we're looking at is what information do we need in order to prioritize, schedule, and estimate the work. Valuable. Now, a story needs to be valuable. If you can't demonstrate the value of this user story to the customer, or the customer can't demonstrate the value of it, what are you doing it for? We don't care about the value to anybody. It needs to be valuable to the customer. Developers are notorious for gold plating things. When you really want that, surely you could, if you only did this, you'd make it so much better and it's more aesthetically pleasing to us. Well, fine, but is it valuable to the customer? Does the customer value it? If not, then we don't want it. Now, this is particularly an issue when you're splitting stories, and there are times when you'll actually have to split the stories because one is getting too big. Think of the whole story as a multi-layer cake, and this is where you get to people talking about epics as well as stories. The network layer, persistent layer, logic layer, when we split a story, we're serving up only part of that cake, and we want to give the customer the essence of the whole cake. And the best way to do that is to slice vertically through the layers. Developers often have a tendency to work on one layer at a time, and we like to get things complete and finished. I mean, it's annoying to half build something. We really want to finish the job. Well, I'm sorry, when you're doing these things, you're probably going to have to half finish the job and complete the entire vertical slice, not just each layer. Estimable. We want enough information so that we can estimate the amount of effort that's required to build this. I did say effort, not time, because the duration depends on who's working on it, how many people are working on it, and their expertise. But effort, we want to know some sort of effort. We want to know not effort in terms of hours or days, but effort, relative effort. And software developers, after a very limited amount of experience, are able to say, in relative terms, this is 2 units or 3 units or 8 units or 1 unit of effort. And the job I did yesterday, if that was 1 unit, then this is worth 3 units. Okay, it should take me about 3 days. So it's relative time that or relative effort we're looking at, right? You get into estimation. I don't particularly want to do that, so we'll leave that alone. Small. A number of planning poker games refuse to go past a measure of about 8, and even some don't even want to go to 8 because they figure that when you're getting up to 8, there are so many unknowns in that effort that we really want to break it down and find out what these unknowns are. So we want good stories to be small. If they're big, there's so much detail in there that affects their estimate, their value, the whole lot of other things. We don't know enough about what it is to say anything useful about it. So we want them to be small. Alistair Cockburn described cards as tokens promising a future conversation, and the details to be elaborated through conversations with the customer. Alistair Cockburn did say some reasonably good things, and that's probably among them. So he's talking about a user story as a token for a future conversation that we're going to have with the customer. Well, let's not forget that. Right at the start, we're not trying to elaborate the user story fully. We're trying to simply capture the early essence of the user story so that we can then go back to the customer and say, oh, you remember you said about this, and they know what we're talking about. Testable. A good story is testable. Now, test-first development insists that you have a test up front. But if a user story has value, we want some sort of a test for that value. It carries the implicit promise. A test does carry that, right? I understand what you want well enough that I could write a test for it. Not that I have written a test, but that I could write a test for it. Several teams have reported that by requiring customer tests before implementing a story, the team is more productive, because when you can write a test and the customer agrees that yes, that is a reasonable test of whether you've succeeded in implementing the story or not, then you've probably understood it well enough. If you aren't able to write a test, you probably haven't understood it. If the customer doesn't know how to test something, this may indicate that the story isn't clear enough even to them that you could start implementing it. So, a test is a pretty good way of doing things. The team can treat non-functional requirements such as performance and usability as things that need to be tested, and you can make up some sort of a story about it. These things, they're not that hard to phrase tests for. I mean, performance, what do you want? So many transactions a second? Or do you want a response within half a second when there are 50 users on the system? What is that? So in summary then, this is a wonderful acronym for checking the value of user stories called INVEST. Independent, negotiable, estimable, small, and testable. I missed valuable. Independent, negotiable, valuable, estimable, small, testable.